Writing Out Loud, a program designed to explore in-depth interviews with writers to hear that words have voices. Our hostess for today's program is Teresa Miller, Executive Director for the Oklahoma Center for Poets and Writers at OSU Tulsa.
Hello, everyone. I'm Teresa Miller, and welcome to Writing Out Loud. I'm sitting here with one of my favorite people in the whole wide world, Earl Hamner, creator of the Waltons.
Good morning, Teresa. How nice to be with you.
Oh, it's so nice to be with you. I've told you the story that when I was growing up, my grandmother wouldn't let me watch the Waltons because she said we were so dysfunctional that watching a happy family might give me false expectations. Huh?
Oh, I don't think we've corrupted anybody so far that I know of.
No, but you're my rebellious side,
right.
So I'm so gratified by our friendship. You've written a memoir, Good Night, John Boy,
yes,
about your years on the show. And you know, that show is still playing everywhere. And I met a woman just yesterday who gets up at 7 o'clock every morning to watch the Waltons. Yeah. How do you explain the ongoing popularity of this program?
Well, I can explain a bit of it because people have remarked about the series several times, and the remarks seem to come down to either I watched the show because that's the way I lived, that was the way I experienced life, or else it's the way I wish I had lived. And it somehow, through those two factors, have reached an international audience and people of wide backgrounds and ethnic persuasion, and it seems to be universal, which delights me and amazes me that it has such an incredible appeal.
Oh, I think it does. Before you wrote for the Waltons and created the Waltons, you wrote for the Twilight Zone. That's quite a transition from the Twilight Zone to a Happy Family.
It is, but yet in the Twilight Zone area, I was able to contribute something that nobody had done before. So I was very proud of that, in that all of my stories for the Twilight Zone have a kind of folkish appeal, and are folkish stories. They might have even been folk stories. One of them that I did was called Jezebel. It was about a 2-hour episode in which a girl sells her soul to the devil for a man's love. And people do that down where I come from in Virginia. And there was one of my first ones for the Twilight Zone was about an old man and a dog, which was inspired my father's love for his hunting dog, which he inadvertently, accidentally killed, and never quite got over the grief. And I used that as a sort of jumping off place for the story. As a matter of fact, I just have completed in 2006 a new Twilight Zone episode, because there's a producer in Hollywood who's trying to get the show going again, and it's to be called The Lost Episodes of Rod Serling, but they're not quite Rod's lost episodes because a group of us are writing them. But again, it's a kind of folkish story that I've just finished about a Civil War lieutenant. No, let me do it the other way around. A young couple are passing a cemetery, and they see a sign saying "free dirt," and so they take some home and put it in a flower pot. And as they walk away from the flower pot, you can see a plant beginning to grow. And the next morning, there's a rose in the pot, and then they get the husband gets in a truck going somewhere, and it takes him back to the cemetery where he sees a Confederate lieutenant who sort of disappears. And then at night they hear crying, and they can't discover the source of the crying. And then there's a picture of the wife on the mantle, and they look at it one day, and her picture has been replaced by a picture of a young woman who might be alive during the Confederate times. And so they consult the library, and they find the name of this woman, and then they go into her family history and find that she was married to a young Confederate lieutenant. And they find a letter from him, which is a very beautiful letter, saying that he loved her beyond life and that they would never be separated, not even in death. And so the woman realizes that was not free dirt, that was the remains of the young bride. And so they take it back to the graveyard and place it in this grave. And as they look back, they see the young lieutenant hold out his hand, and the beautiful young woman goes into his arms. So someone said, you just can't get over your romanticism, can you?
Well, that carried across into the Waltons, and of course your voice introduced the show, and that was the signature element of it. How autobiographical was the Waltons? I mean, episode by episode.
Well, the structure of the family was exactly the way my family was structured, and the characters are based somewhat, but not totally, on the family members. My mother was an extremely devout Baptist. My father was a hellion, and it took an awful lot of work to get him to be baptized. The character of John Boy, of course, wanted to be a writer, as I did. And the Mary Ellen character was based very much on my sister Marion, who was a tomboy. And Jim Bob was the youngest, and the character of Aaron, who was sort of the middle child, was sort of the classic middle child. And so sadly in my life, so many of my brothers and sisters have gone. Now, of course, my mother and the grandparents have been gone for some time, but I'm beginning to lose the brothers and sisters. But there's a slight consolation. It's not very much, but the young actors who portrayed my brothers and sisters still exist in a kind of family way. That Mary Beth, who played Erin, will frequently call me, and
that's nice.
If there's some sort of celebration, like a marriage or a birth, or sadly a funeral, we all get together again and hug each other and cry and carry on, kiss.
That's wonderful. I want it to be that way. I've hoped it would be that way.
Yeah.
What did the family back in Virginia think about the show when it came on?
Well, I think that first they wondered what it was going to be like, what it would be like to be portrayed by Hollywood actors. I know in Spencer's Mountain, when I called home to tell my father that Henry Fonda was going to portray him, my father had limited vocabulary. He only went to the second grade, but he expressed himself pretty much with profanity, which distressed my mother a great deal. So I called and I said, Dad, you're going to be portrayed, Henry Fonda is going to be you. Long silence on the phone, and then finally he expressed his wonder by saying, I'll be a son of a bitch. I told that to Jack Warner when they bought the movie and the book, and Mr. Warner appreciated that very much. He liked to meet the authors of the books he had bought, but he loved that story.
What did you think of the film version?
I had some qualifications. In the first place, they shot it in Grand Tetons rather than the old Appalachian Mountains, so that changed the character. Also, I didn't get to write the script. The director, the condition of the sale was that the director write the script, wow. And he had this kind of lascivious approach to some of the situations. Like at one point, there was a line where the father says to the mother, oh, it reminds me of when we were young and used to sneak off in the bushes. And I do hope my mother and father sneaked off into the bushes and that they had a wonderful young time. But had my mother seen that in a movie, she would have died on the spot. So I was able to get them to remove that. But there were occasional lapses of good taste. But on the other side, Fonda was wonderful in the role of the father.
Oh, I thought
and
so too.
Marina Hara as the mother, and Jimmy MacArthur was good as the young man. I must tell you, being at the convention and having Pat Conroy, of all people, say, I loved that film. I mean, that was so gratifying. He even asked about some of the characters, and he knew the film by heart.
Still watches the Waltons and reruns.
I said, when I meet somebody that I admire a great deal, I tend to gush, but I will attempt to restrain myself. So I've had to restrain myself around Pat because I admire him so much.
He's a wonderful author, as are you. Waltons was on over 9 years. As you look back over the different episodes, which stand out to you?
There were several. One was called Grandma Comes Home, because Ellen Corby was our grandmother, the actress who played the grandmother. And during I think our fourth or fifth season, she had a stroke, and it affected her speech, it affected her motor ability, and we didn't think Ellen would come back to the series, but she wanted to, and she's such a superb actress that she was able to come back, and even without speech was able to fulfill the role of Grandma. As a matter of fact, she made it even more eloquent, because sometimes I remember one script where she was felt neglected, and everybody was pampering her and being too nice. And finally, Olivia, the mother, said to her, "Grandma, what's the matter with you?" And she had two words, but they were the most effective I've ever heard. She said, "Need me."
Oh, yeah, I remember that episode.
Oh, that was so... And I love the episode where John Boy goes to New York, because it approximated so much my own feelings and experience when I left for New York.
You actually coached Ellen Corby a little bit, didn't you, with her speech?
Well, yes,
there's some unusual therapy you used for her.
Well, in the beginning of a series, to get accustomed to each other and to hear the voices, you read the script around a table. And I was a little put off by Ellen's interpretation of Grandma. And after the reading, I asked her to go to come aside. And I, as diplomatically as I could, I said, "Ellen, I love you. I admire your talent. But my grandmother was a very sweet little old lady, and she was totally loving. And I'm a little disturbed because you've given her such bitterness. She seems sort of unhappy, unlikely, and not at all sympathetic." And Ellen said, and I said, "She's a sweet woman." And Ellen said, "Young man, you have got so many sweet people in this series that you're going to give the audience sugar diabetes." And she said, "Let me take the character and be tart and vinegary, and I promise you it'll work." And of course she was right, because that Grandma, in spite of her tartness and edge, was a totally lovable character.
When you've been with a show for 9 years, how hard is it to move on to other projects?
Well, it's a process of decompressing, I guess, and missing the personal relationships. But I have always had more things to write, more passion for writing things than I could accomplish. And I'm 83 now, and I've got about 150 things that I've got to complete before I go to that Writers Guild in the sky. But I understand that you can delay death as long as you have something unfinished. So I quickly start one project after I finish another one.
That's, I think, very sound advice. You know, one of my favorite parts of the show, Earl, was at the end when everybody would say good night to each other, and it was very touching. Have you seen the singular commercial on television where everybody's saying good night to each other?
I not only have seen it, I was in it.
That was your voice
Yeah.
then? Was that great fun for you?
Oh, it was great. I've told this story, but my agent called and said, "There's an agency in New York that called me this morning, and they say, want to know if Earl Hamner is still alive." And he said, "I'll call him and see." And then he said they offered us an astonishing amount of money. And I said, "Take it." And he said, "No, my agent, being an agent, said, no, I can double that if you let me bargain for it. And I said, "Don't bargain for it, Mike. I don't want to take any chances of losing it. It sounds like it's fun to do." But he persisted, and I said, "Mike, I don't want you bargaining. I am old and rich, and I don't need the money." And he said, "But I'm young and poor, and I do need the money." But we settled for the original offer.
Well, did you get a pretty good singular plan out of the deal?
They keep promising me that I will get one, which would be fun.
There's been a wonderful biography written about you, Earl Hamner, From Waltons Mountain to Tomorrow, by James E. Person, Jr. Did you learn anything about yourself that surprised you in this book?
I learned that I'm totally immodest because I loved everything that he said, which is very congratulatory. But what it did was to convince me that while Mr. Walton will be on my tombstone, that I have done a great many other things, like books, other television, other films. And I'm proud of all of them. But he really brought to life a full career rather than just a slice of it.
Well, it's a great book, and I've learned things about you that I didn't know before, and it's just a wonderful resource book and a wonderful legacy book. Talking about other projects, you wrote or produced a film version of Eudora Welty's The Ponder Heart.
Yes.
Why do you as a writer admire her so much and her work?
The first thing that comes to me is her humanity, her humanness. And I never met her. Her superb talent, and her ability, I think, to make literature out of a fairly limited lifetime, or it seemed limited to me. I learned from the biography that her life was much broader than I had thought.
Yes.
I'll never forget when I went to Jackson to film this movie, I thought, oh God, I'll meet Eudora. And I'd looked forward so much to that.
Of course.
But her niece, Mary Alice White, and Donnie said, well, she's ill, but if there's a good day, we'll take you over and you can meet Eudora. So I kept waiting for a good day, but none ever appeared. But I knew where she lived, so the last day I was in Jackson, I went over and stood on her front lawn and put my hand over my heart, hoping that she might be looking out the window. I learned later that she had been, by that time, she couldn't do stairs, and so she was downstairs. But you've met her, really?
I stopped by her house.
Oh, you lucky devil.
Just dropped by.
Yeah,
I was pretty cheeky. I was like 18 years old on the way to a meeting, and
but
I thought...
I envy you that.
Well, she was worried about her plumber, so it was, so it wasn't, we didn't have the deep literary conversation I'd always dreamed of. You've got a new book out, Generous Women.
Yeah.
Why generous women as apart from just generous people?
Well, because looking back over my life, I decided that I have benefited from the generosity of an extraordinary number of people. I was saying a while ago that I read a piece by Anna Quindlen in Newsweek not long ago, in which she's talking about the status of women in the world today. And she says, we have risen on the shoulders of all the women who have gone before us. And I thought, gee, that's what my book is about.
Right.
I too have risen on the shoulders of women, on my mother, on the actresses who have portrayed me, my mother, on my wife, my daughter, famous women like Eleanor Roosevelt.
Yes, I wanted to ask you why you included Eleanor. Tell us your Eleanor Roosevelt
I was
story.
to interview her once for a show called Biography and Sound. This was for NBC in New York, and I was delayed because of a subway breakdown. And I thought, my God, I've got the First Lady of the land waiting. I was horrified, and I thought by the time I got there 45 minutes later, she would have gone. But she wasn't gone. She was still sitting in the studio, and I rushed in, and I practically fell to my feet. And she said, "Oh, please don't apologize. You gave me a chance to get caught up with my correspondence." And she then proceeded to talk about her Uncle Teddy, who was the subject of the biography. And one of the stories she told was quite charming. She said that he had a theory that the way to teach somebody to swim was to throw them in Oyster Bay. And when she was 6 years old, she went out to see him, and he decided to teach her to swim, tossed her in the bay, and she disproved his theory. But a charming, lovely woman, just an exciting person. But, you know, there are other ladies in the book, like Tallulah Bankhead.
Yeah, I was going to ask you, she was such an interesting person.
Oh, she's a fascinating
wild,
woman.
flamboyant.
Yes.
And a southerner to the heart.
Oh, God. Well, that was one of the things that attracted me about this, to write about the encounter with her. I wrote an obituary of Lionel Barrymore, who had been a friend of hers, and this was for radio, and I handed it in to the editor, and then the day that Tallulah was to record it, the sound man said, "Earl, would you like to go over and hear Tallulah record your words?" And of course I rushed the opportunity. And it was early morning when we got there. She lived at the Hotel Elysee right off Fifth Avenue. And her companion at that time was a comedian named Patsy Kelly. Mm-hmm. And it was 11 o'clock in the morning, and Patsy said, "Oh, Miss B's not up yet." But she said, "I'll go see if I can wake her." And she went down the hall, and we could hear the coughing and groaning and all those noises that I suppose a talented actress makes to face the day. And shortly Tallulah arrived, and she leaned against she was dressed in a sort of nightgown, very attractive, even at that time of day. And she leaned against the door jamb and looked around the room and said, "Champagne." And Patsy said, "For everybody, Miss B?" And Tallulah said, "No, darling, just for me." And so she sat down and she read the copy, and she looked over at George Voutsas, the producer, and said, "This is beautiful. Who wrote it?" And George said, "Earl did, Miss B, another Southerner." And she looked at me and said, "Naturally, darling." So, you know, with ladies of that kind in my background, no wonder that I wanted to do a whole book about them.
Yeah, Harper Lee's included.
Absolutely. And I never, again, someone I love very much, but I never met. I spoke with her by phone. She had written beautiful endorsements for 2 of my books. And she was in Hollywood, and I knew that she was at Universal. And I called there, and she was on the set. But later she called back, and I'll never forget her voice because it was so Southern and so intimate. It was just, "Earl, this is Harper." And I thought, oh my God, this, she's on the phone. So I said, "We live not far from Universal. I could come get you and come to dinner." And she said, "I'm getting her to Hollywood." And I could tell it was not the most pleasant experience she'd had. But I admire her so much.
Oh, yeah.
And in the book, in my chapter on Harper Lee, because of people being so peevish about the fact that she's never written another book, I put one little observation, which was that she's already been to Everest. Why should she go there twice?
That's nicely said.
I think
Great insight.
she'll like that.
I think so.
Yeah,
I bet she'll read the book. I'm
hope.
sure.
I'll send a copy as soon as I get one.
Kay Thompson, another woman.
Oh, what a lovely woman. The reason she is there is that I was writing a show for Andy Williams, who had worked with Kay Thompson when he was a little boy. He was a boy soprano, and he knew that I had lived in Paris and that I loved Paris, and I also, because of his association with Kay Thompson, who wrote the book, Eloise books,
right.
I told him how much I liked Eloise. Jane and I, whenever we went to New York, always stopped by the plaza to see the picture of Eloise in the lobby. And so one week I couldn't write Andy's show because I was ill, and I called him and said, "I'm sorry, but we'll get somebody else to do the copy." And the phone rang, and this glamorous voice said, "Earl?" And I said, "Yes." She said, "This is Kay Thompson." And I thought, good God. She said, "I hear you love Paris." And I said, "I do." And she said, "I hear you love Eloise." And I said, "I do." She said, "Well, I've just written a book called Eloise in Paris. I want to read it to you." So she read the entire book. It was, an extraordinary thing to happen.
What about some of the not-so-famous women in the book that have made important contributions, apart from your family? And you've mentioned your mom. And
Well, school, there are lots of teachers. One was the teacher in my 6th grade class. We used to have autograph books where our classmates would write doggerel, mainly, in autographs. But this teacher was Miss Olive Giannini, who was a distant relative, and in my autograph book she wrote something. It was a quote from Longfellow, which said, "Heights of great men reached and kept were not attained by sudden flight, but they, while their companions slept, were toiling upward in the night." And I thought that was brilliant, and it came to me from time to time when I was toiling upward in the night, usually on a second job to keep me going, or other times that were difficult. That was encouraging. And I think that school teachers, probably as important as parents in their guidance of young people.
Oh, yeah.
And it was interestingly, in that 6th grade where Miss Giannini wrote that, today there is one room of the Walton Museum that is visited by people from all over the world.
Tell us about the Walton Museum.
It's an exact replica of all the rooms that we had on the series, and some of my awards. I guess my favorite room is the recipe room, because we had these lovely old women who were actually bootleggers, but were very genteel on the show.
Right.
And they
Baldwin sisters.
Yes, who were based on. On the television series, I made them sisters, but in real life, they were a mother and daughter, and they were nowhere so elegant as the people I made them on television. Actually, when you went to their home, and as my father and a lot of my uncles did, they did not serve the recipe in silver goblets, but in a tin dipper. Talk about remaking life as you wish it had been. I gave it a shine.
How good was the recipe?
It's very strong. But the funny thing is that when I go back to Virginia, there invariably people show up with quart mason jars of the recipe, and my brother, who kept most of the refrigerator, was overflowing with recipe. But it's very, very strong and very intoxicating.
I hope to try it sometime.
It was a form of apple brandy, the one that they made.
Yeah.
You must try it, but be prepared to sit down quickly.
Okay. Do you keep a stash in California?
No, my wife wouldn't let me do something like that.
You're currently working on a stage production. Tell us about that.
Well,
you just have a minute here.
Okay. I've always thought that Spencer's Mountain would make a wonderful stage play, because it's been a movie, it's been a book. And I felt that today the world is in such turmoil that people want the reassurance and security of a good family story. And I thought that Spencer's Mountain would be the spine for such a story. So I'm adapting the book that I wrote many, many years ago today as a stage play. It's great fun, and I'm enjoying it tremendously.
Earl, I've loved having you on Writing Out Loud. I mentioned how much I love the Waltons' Good Night.
Oh.
Could you say good night to everybody for us?
Good night. Good night. Good night, everybody. Thank you. It's wonderful to be with Teresa.